So I was thinking what I would approach it, and I would say I would approach it, having spent all these years in Washington since '92, as a brief to Secretary of State, President, you name it. What is on the agenda today between the US and Russia? And clearly, we have a deteriorating trajectory, at least since the US adventure in Iraq, 2003. Russia was extremely negative at the time. I tried, being at Heritage at the time, to find some kind of a mediating platform or function. I talked to the Russian side, talked to Dan Fried, my colleague now at the Atlantic Council, who was then the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Russia. And I said a simple thing back then. If we recognize the legitimate Russian interest in Iraq, and these were the multi-billion-dollar debt of Saddam's regime to Russia, and the Russian interest in the oil and gas, the West Kurna field, big oil field, and the Russian involvement in the electricity sector, maybe we can find common language. Our side was not interested in recognizing any Russian interest. Putin got extremely pissed off. And while Condi Rice, who was, I think, the National Security Advisor at the time, said we should not escalate with Russia and we should try to put the French down, ignore the Germans and hug Russia, something like that. It didn't work. Move forward 5 years, the Russians attacked Georgia. Well, Georgians attacked Russia, the Russians counterpunch very hard in Georgia, and the relationship continues to deteriorate. Move forward, I published a piece at the time predicting that if we don't push back on the Russian aggression in Georgia, bad things will happen in the Crimea, I said, my birthplace, and Ukraine. And so it happened in 2014, as you know. So we have a number of primarily geopolitical flashpoints with Russia. I would say Ukraine is number one. We are stuck. They are not willing to recognize sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, let alone the Crimea. Even if Moscow changes its position and stops supporting the secessionist forces in the Donbass and would allow the Ukrainian government to control its border in the east, the Crimea is a long-term problem that it will be very difficult to resolve. The second issue I would say is using the Black Sea and the Crimea, as they always did for 200 plus years, to jump to the Mediterranean, that's Syria, 2014, 2015, the naval bases in Syria, and the support of the Assad regime, which also allows Russia to develop a very strong security relationship with Iran, and create a foothold in the Middle East, not just in Syria. And then now we see Russia supporting General Haftar in Libya and trying to stand up a naval base, anchorage, whatever that is, in Sudan. So you see Black Sea, the Black Sea, Eastern Med, the Red Sea, and Libya. The private security group called Wagner, Wagner with a V, like the composer, only different, ran by a Putin associate, also known as the Kremlin cook, Mr. Prigozhin. I believe the first name is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who has his fingers in a bunch of things. The St. Petersburg bot farm, internet operations, disinformation. operations against the United States in cyberspace, but also private security companies that are active in Syria, in Libya, Libya, Central African Republic, Madagascar. So this privatization of foreign and security policy is bad and dangerous, provides them some amount of plausible deniability, but also much more opaque than people in uniforms that you can easily monitor. So I'll be happy to talk about that. I think this is something fundamentally different than what the Soviets did. The Soviets clearly did not have private security firms connected to the general secretary. They had intel operations, of course, all over the world. My master's at Fletcher was on power projection in the third world through front organizations. It's still in the library somewhere. You're welcome to look at it. It's kind of long, it's 120 pages. But they were involved in what we see now as disinformation and bot farms before there was the internet. So that was all on paper, but the MO I recognized very easily from my master's research on influence operations or wars of ideas and all that good stuff. So moving on, I think the centerpiece of the US-Russian relations, as always, is arms control. I was personally very happy that we signed that 5-year extension of START. I believe that as the great powers built the edifice of arms control for 60 plus years, since Khrushchev was in power, we need to continue with that. At the same time, as the nuclear balance is changing around the world, as we add nuclear powers and players, China, as the Trump administration was hammering, but also India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, we need to take that into account. When I was at Heritage, we did Simulex type exercises in the nuclear space and with anti-ballistic missile components and whatnot. And the more players you add to a nuclear balance of terror, the more unstable the environment becomes. So we need, the P5 and the new members. And by the way, I do not believe for a moment that we can push the genie back into the nuclear bottle, be it North Korea, be it India, Pakistan, be it Israel. And in the future, unfortunately, Turkey, Saudi, and possibly Egypt. We cannot push it back in the nuclear bottle, disarm. South Africa is an outlier. Argentina, Brazil are outliers. Argentina and Brazil did not have working nukes. We need to think how we build this multilateral nuclear arms control regime. And the Russians, I sat through a Zoom meeting with the Russian ambassador 2 days ago, courtesy of Council of Foreign Relations, of which I'm a member, chaired by Tom Graham. For those of you who know Tom was a senior director in the Bush administration, NSC senior director for Russia. And Ambassador Antonov said, no, if the Chinese want to come to the table, fine. It's a talking point. I heard it from Antonov and from others many times. If the Chinese want to come to the table, fine. And please tell me, do you Americans want to bring down your nuclear arsenal, 1,550 strategic warheads and unknown number of TAC nukes, down to the Chinese level, allegedly 350, or you want the Chinese to build up to the American level of 1,550 American and Russian, because we're at parity. So to me, it's a signal they're not serious about that. They don't talk about TAC nukes. They don't talk about India, Pakistan, and it's a disingenuous position. Yes, we need to keep our ceiling because otherwise we re-enter a horrible, very expensive and destabilizing nuclear race. But they need to carry their own weight in that. Moving on, the Russians are talking about negotiations on new systems, space, maybe cyber, hypersonics. I don't think they're very excited because they try to convince us they have a lead in hypersonic missiles. But we have a choice. We can either try and attain technological domination, as we tried in the past, or we need to sit down with the Russians and with the Chinese and possibly with others and talk about arms control. I'm kind of agnostic about that because there were certain successes and many failures in arms control. There were very strict arms control agreements before World War I on battleships. There were arms control agreements during the Cold War that were, in my book, a bit more successful. So with the current level of mistrust between Russia and the US and outright hatred expressed by a lot of Russian players, actors, the media for sure, can that be successful? Honestly, I don't know. I would encourage you guys to express your opinion about that. The Russians, when I was talking earlier about how the relationship deteriorated, the 2002 US exit from the ABM under Bush, the ABM Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that was another blow. The Russians expected for us to stick to the moratorium on the ABM. There is a faction in Washington, especially strong among the Republicans, that want to develop US ABM. I instinctively would like to see something that can shoot down missiles. It's very difficult. It is very expensive. We currently have, I may be off by a missile or two, but we have about 42 actual interceptors, mostly in the West Coast and Alaska, that are capable of shooting down a incoming ballistic missile if we more or less know when it's coming. So the tests are, hey guys, in 6 hours from this quadrant, there's going to be a missile coming. The radars go up, the interceptors go up, and it takes about 3 interceptors to down one incoming. So guess what? 42 divided by 3 is 14, right? Is that right? It may be effective against a single or a couple of missiles coming from North Korea or eventually from Iran. Iran doesn't have ICBMs, but it's not effective against anything that China or Russia can throw at us. And then the question is, what does that mean for our security? The answer is pretty clear. We're not protected. Moving on, other pieces that fell apart, the INS, Intermediate Nuclear Treaty, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev, I believe in '87, and Open Skies. All the last two ones died under Trump. Why? Don't ask me. We said they violated, but we were the ones who initiated the exit. An important centerpiece of the relationship, the one that Russians are more comfortable dealing with because, as I said, 3 generations of arms controllers and being a part of this mutually assured destruction mentality. Yeah, we should pursue that. We don't have a clear answer on Ukraine. We don't have a clear answer on Syria, although the trend in the last, I would say, at least 3 administrations, is start pulling the US out of the Middle East. Bush, Obama, Trump, or you can look at it, Obama, Trump, Biden. The trend is going to be to reduce, maybe not eliminate, but reduce our profile and our involvement in the Middle East. So the Russians will stay in Syria. I would say great powers should abhor vacuum. A long piece on vacuum from the Institute Center for Global Policy. I think it was included in the list of publications we gave you. So I would say figure out how to prevent the creation of the vacuum in the Middle East or Africa into which the Chinese and the Russians would walk in. Let's talk to our European allies. They want to play a bigger role in sort of a post-COVID world, and they're very uncomfortable, they're deeply uncomfortable with the US power. It's very funny, it's for decades. If something happens, they scream, oh, we're the United States. Think Kosovo and the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. But when the US comes and bombs, they start screaming the hyperpuissance, the hyperpower. They don't like that. They talk about the EU-based power component, and of course that means, as a colleague of mine recently said, that means Germany pays for France to maintain its nuclear triad and its power, because Germany is cutting and cutting and cutting. The Britain is cutting and cutting and cutting their forces. The projection of British forces by 2025 is 75,000. That's nothing, okay? And a colleague of mine is the advisor to the British Navy. He says that this beautiful Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier that they put out, I think 60,000 tons, big piece. It doesn't have the avionics, it doesn't have the electronics, it doesn't have the protection weaponry. It's a half-baked, essentially. It's half-baked pie, if you want, that they played out in a war game. The Russians attacking the Queen Elizabeth, and they took it out in 5 minutes. So, all right, moving on. So the question is, who is going to help us to fill these vacuums in Africa and the Middle East that we don't feel like spending too much money doing? Living to the class would welcome your opinion. Moving on, one important thing I want to cover in the geopolitical space, and then turn to the Russian domestic discussion. So in the geopolitical piece, probably the most important relationship I see is Russia-China. It began under the late Yevgeny Primakov, the then foreign minister, former prime minister, former head of the services, a wily guy. I had the misfortune of getting on his shit list because I published something that the intelligence community leaked to me saying that he's taking money from Saddam Hussein. When that happened, he was prime minister, so it must be after the Russian collapse of 96. So that's like 98, before he was kicked out by Yeltsin. So I publish it, and I get a phone call of his trusted associate in Washington, whose name I will not mention. And he says, Ariel, you published this. The old man is very mad. I said, are you threatening me? I said, no, how can I threaten you? I said, well, it's a prime minister, foreign minister, former head of the services, the guy who has his fingers, it was a money bag for Arafat and Saddam in the 50s and the 60s. He said, no, but his messages to you, cease and desist. Said, I got the messages, I got kids. Okay, tell him no more. That's it. And then years later, Primakov and I sat down in a conference in Malta and then another conference in Jordan. And we sort of made our peace, had a civilized discussion. Things happen in this world, and that was it. So that's my Yevgeny Primakov story. So under Primakov, he came out with the idea of the multipolar world. And in the 90s, everybody laughed. Russia was, as they say, on its knees. What multipolar world? So multipolar world was Russia, India, and China against the West, against the US. And you see, well, what he thought was a multipolar world became a Chinese-centric word with Russia as a second fiddle. But yet, it's a very important relationship because if you look at the map, Russia is looking west and China is looking east, and they got each other's back. So they're standing back to back, facing into different directions. It's an easy way to think about it spatially. Focusing on Europe and the Middle East, China is focusing for now at the Pacific, but also the Belt and Road into Central Asia. The friction starts against China, the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, Burma, the islands, into the east coast of Africa, into the Suez Canal and the Persian Gulf, and then into Europe. So that is an important relationship as we're looking at the key conflict of the 21st century and possibly beyond if we don't blow each other off the surface of the planet. And that's the US and its allies, India, Japan, Australia, smaller guys, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Russia being a de facto ally. My colleague, Steve Blank, says that Russia is the ally. And of course, we, being trained as lawyers and whatnot, say, well, show me the piece of paper. And Steve says, well, the piece of paper is probably in Putin's safe deposit box, and in Chairman Xi's safe deposit box, a secret protocol of sorts that that define that relationship, and we may not know it. So that's, if I was at the Security Council, National Security Council, tasking the intelligence community, go get me what they have as a secret agreement between Beijing and Moscow on their relationship. But you see there's more military cooperations, arms transfers, military technology transfers, and also foreign policy coordination. Very interesting relationship, definitely worth somebody's PhD or master's to explore. And finally, a few words on the domestic piece. You saw Navalny deciding to go back to Russia after he was poisoned, some amount of protest, Navalny being locked up, and I think there's one or two more court cases against him. Some amount of unrest based on the slowly deteriorating economic situation. As I was preparing for today, there was a Wall Street Journal report from a town of Oryol. I haven't been to Oryol, but I've been to many, many towns like Oryol. Oryol is in central Russia. I've been to Tula, which is sort of a sister town, arms manufacturing. I've been to Tobolsk, I've been to Barnaul, I've been to Kostroma. So I've been to the second and third tier cities, and the life in those cities is grim, drunk, and unexciting. This is not Moscow. Moscow is really very much on the level in terms of the living standard, excitement, entertainment. It's like Europe. The second and third tier cities are not, and it's interesting. Whereas for decades, the historians were saying that the regime in Russia changes in the capital, and that's why Putin is spending so much money in Moscow, including for good things. You know, if it's urbanism, as they call it, the urban development under the mayor Sobyanin, metro, meaning subway, airports linked to with trains, fast trains to the city, which we don't have in Washington, D.C. So Moscow, if 20 or 30,000 people in a 10 million city come out and demonstrate, they can beat them up, they can log them up, they can prosecute them. If the whole of Russia rises, that's a different scenario. For now, we don't see any evidence of Navalny being able to lead that. Things may change. Historically, as you know, it's Russia losing a war and having food supply chain serious disturbances, you know, hunger or close, right? As long as that doesn't happen, the conventional wisdom is that the regime will not change. I have a lot of friends on Facebook and in real life in Russia, primarily in Moscow, and probably the majority of them are telling me that they're not on the verge of any kind of revolution, and the minority is saying, oh, you know, give it a couple of years and it'll all go down. And one of these people who keeps telling me that, he keeps telling me that now for 15 or 20 years, that Putin has 2 years left. I don't see an indication of that yet. And also, I'm looking at survey data. Survey data is his popularity is probably in the 50s, and he has total control of the national television. Now he is introducing deputy principals of schools, of middle school, high school, whatever, deputy principal for education, for воспитание, education in the sense of morals and not academics, the other stuff, right? So they have military training, they have patriotic training. So they are conditioning the population to be loyal, and also they're using a very strong, suppressive, oppressive toolbox, like we saw with Navalny and other dissidents. They send people to jail for a repost on Twitter or Facebook. Margarita Simonyan, the head of RT and one of the louder propagandists, is saying now, is making noise to support the unplugging Russia from the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So the oppressive nature of the regime that brings me, you know, full loop back to 45 years ago when, as a 16-year-old, I arrived from Saratov to Israel. That regime reminds me now more and more of the Brezhnev era stagnation regime. You know, with the 21st century accoutrements and an important change of the 1990s, that now there's private sector, there's food on the table, the agriculture is functioning much better than under the Soviets, and that was one of the key reasons that brought the Soviet power down. And also, I believe that the current generation of leaders, all the Chekists, all the KGB guys, Putin, Patrushev, Sechin, they're all KGB. They understand that the only way out of the situation, as they say in Russian, is legs first, is to the cemetery. They want to die in office. The question to me is, do the younger people, the younger generation of leaders, believe that everything should remain as this high authoritarian type of a regime that Putin built, or there are other ideas? And I think this is a topic for another lecture.